acrimonious divorce kind of threw a monkey wrench in all of my plans. And fortunately, my ex-husband and I have gotten here to co-parent our son. He's had some medical challenges, and now he's going to be 18 soon, and hopefully be able to get along a little bit better without Mom keeping him on such a short leash. I'm ready to get back into the field of mediation.
Lovely. Thank you so much. Diane? I think Diane might not be able to grab us. Joan, may we jump to you?
Yeah, I'm Joan Webster, and I'm in Worcester, Massachusetts, and I am with the Community Mediation Services at the Center for Nonviolent Solutions, and we are in a very odd position of not being part of any court system. We are we have been struggling to get cases, and the next court approval becomes possible in 2015, and I don't know if we'll be able to pull that off. All of us who are part of the group have done mediation in small claims court and are trained and experienced in a variety of ways. And how all of that happened is way too long and awful a story to tell. And I am hoping that this webinar will have something to offer us.
Great. Thank you so much, Joan. Carmit, are you able to share with us?
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, hi, I'm Carmit Bowman. I'm the director of the Conflict Resolution Center in Minneapolis.
Lovely, thank you. And Rebecca, are you able to say hello?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, great. I used to work very closely with Dan Koss at the New York State Unified Court System. I'm now home full-time with my son and doing some consulting work, and I've just started to help work with the New York State Dispute Resolution Association to coordinate a statewide advocacy campaign to help restore some of the funding that's been lost to the community mediation centers around New York State. So I'm really interested in hearing the lessons learned here today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Deborah, you're able to move on ahead.
All right, well, thank you. And I, my preference, I think all of us who are in mediation so value participation of all of the people at the table, and so I appreciate taking a little bit of the time just to hear where people's interests are, and want to just note that my friends in New York, Mark Collins was on the NAFCM board at the same time I was, and so got a little bit of insight about New York, and I was very saddened back in, what was it, 2007, when we had the Great Recession and New York State cut a lot of its funds and to the mediation centers, and friends in New York City that lost their positions, and I'm sure that's happened in other places in the United States as well. So all of that to say that each of our states have a different experience. Nebraska is
I'm in the middle of a webinar.
Is unique.
Yeah, go somewhere else.
I hear somebody talking in the background. Is everybody okay? So what I'm sharing about Nebraska obviously works here, and hopefully there'll be some ideas that might be nurturing and cultivating and planting some seeds from my experience here in Nebraska. So I will tell some of the Nebraska story, and Gabriel, if there's questions, I don't know how you typically handle this, but why don't I just pause every so often and stop and say, are there any questions or comments, and we'll go from there. So if you go to the next screen, Gabriel. And my screen has the time remaining box on the front, in front of the PowerPoint picture, so I'm not sure if there's a way to move that time remaining box from, I don't know if other people are seeing it, not that there's hugely important information behind it, I can pretty much read it. So I'm using this agricultural metaphor, of course, being from the bread basket in Nebraska, the cultivation, nurturing, and sustaining, because at least from my perspective, being involved with the original seed planting of mediation in our state happened in the 80s, which may have been, later than some of you and your experience in your state. The impulse was from the farm mediation when there was the farm crisis going on in the 80s, and we had a network of lawyers, legal aid lawyers, farm agriculture advocates, church people, other therapists at the table saying we need to have some other ways instead of litigation in order to bring people to the table and solve problems. And so that was the impulse to draft Nebraska's Dispute Resolution Act, which was worked on by a collaborative group of people, including some state senators in 1990. And so in 91, our legislature passed what I would call the foundational Dispute Resolution Act, which created my office and the State Court Administrator's Office, the Office of Dispute Resolution, and created a statutory scheme to have regional nonprofit mediation centers across the state. So Nebraska has, we're a fairly large state. It takes about 500 miles from east to west and about 200 miles north to south. And so we've have the urban areas on the eastern part of the state with Omaha and the capital in Lincoln. So we have a mediation center that serves Omaha and an adjoining county, and a mediation center that serves Lincoln, and then the 4 other centers serve multiple counties in rural Nebraska. And that particular concept of having a public-private partnership really made sense for us. And so the centers, the nonprofit centers, were created in 91 and early 92. They celebrated their 20th anniversary a few years ago. We're coming up on the 25th anniversary. And so that's the sustaining part. And I'm fortunate to be sitting in this position at the Office of Dispute Resolution, because my role is to approve annually those 6 mediation centers. And because I started on the ground floor with the initial legislation, and then was the founding director of the Mediation Center in Northeast Nebraska, and now I'm in the State Court Administrator's Office, able to see the trends, the ups and downs of funding and government involvement over the 2+ decades. And so one of the things that I ask all of the participants to consider in terms of stability and sustainability is, and I'm sure you may have well been down this road, is to consider what is your state's constitutional framework about ADR and your statutory framework. Being a lawyer myself, that's how I think. So And I definitely see that having legal minds involved with organizational structure and funding and sustaining is critical. However, I'm very much in the camp of saying who can be credentialed as a mediator depends upon lots of other factors in addition to what kind of degree you have. So one of the things that I think is interesting for every state exercise to do, which I have done, and I have a University of Nebraska law student externs that work with me every semester. They actually paid credit hours in order to give me free work. One of the tasks was to look at all of the statutory language about ADR mediation facilitation that's on the books. And even though I thought I knew all of it, for example, we're resurrecting restorative justice and victim offender mediation this year. Those of you who have been around a long time, and I know many of you have, when I went back and looked at our Nebraska statutes, I saw some language in there about juvenile victim offender mediation that was added in the mid to late 90s. It hadn't been utilized of late, and so that ended up being an asset as we're going forward with this new wave of restorative justice. So again, you know, if you've been around long enough, we know that there's these waves of interest by different stakeholders with different types of ADR. So I think it's a helpful exercise to research your statutory framework and look at, you know, what's actually on the books and can you use any of it to your advantage. And then the other piece along with this, you know, to be reflective about who have been our allies in state government over the past decades. In the executive branch, for example, in Nebraska, the governor's office hasn't really been a big player in ADR in their office themselves, although there was the governor's task force about 10 years ago to investigate child deaths in the child welfare system, and at that point my predecessor worked with the governor's office to have a mediation center individuals facilitate that task force. So that was a good way to bridge relationships between the community mediation centers and current public policy issues in the governor's office. Obviously in the executive branch, we all, I'm sure, work with our Health and Human Services agency as well as our Department of Education. We've worked with the Department of Environmental Quality. I'm sure there's other departments that individual mediation centers have worked with. And I think that's one of, it's on a later slide, but you know, having me in the Office of Dispute Resolution at the state level, making connections and relationships and allies, and then each of the centers themselves are making their own allies and relationships with different executive branch agencies that might be regional in their area, such as Employment First and Voc Rehab, and the regional education entities, you know, that we have the latitude, and I'm sure many mediation centers do, to be creative on the local and regional level, and that can inform the statewide mediation center system as well as local. Judicial branch and legislative branch. You know, I'm in the judicial branch, but frankly, up until when I started here about 10 years ago, in Nebraska we had very nominal court-connected ADR. And I know different states had had gone different directions, but we were more community-based, and so a lot of our clients were referred by, at that time, Health and Human Services, Child Welfare, referred through the child welfare system, not through the court system. And we got, we did do small claims and still do small claims, but it was a very minor part. So it was about 10 years ago that we started ramping up court-connected ADR, and I'll talk more about that in a little bit. Legislative branch obviously is the key ally, and this is where having, at least in Nebraska, having attorneys that are mediators who are also on the legislative committees of the State Bar Association, there's a lot of integration there. We're a small enough state that it works really well. I would hope that in other states that are larger, there's still the opportunity for example, a mediator who's a lawyer is on a board of a community mediation center. They mediate occasionally, but they're primarily board members. This same attorney mediator has a private practice, and they do private mediations. And the same attorney mediator is on the bar's legislative committee. And that example is multiplied several times. So having this lawyer being in these different spheres of influence has really helped open the door and pave the way for new legislative initiatives to both build consensus among the bar for the community mediation initiatives, as well as stand guard against being attacked by some members of the bar. And so those allies in the legislature who, for example, kind of shifting a little bit, the Speaker of our legislature about 7 years ago was a young attorney who, when he was in law school, had mediation training. And so in Nebraska, we've, the Office of Dispute Resolution had laid the groundwork 20 years ago to build a mediation class for law students, both at the public law college as well as at Creighton. And so we have regularly lawyers who, law students who graduated who have had mediation, basic mediation training in the law school, and they get a certificate from my office that they have approved basic training. And so this same speaker had the training when he was in law school, and then when he was speaker, he was who really saw that Nebraska needed to revise its parenting act, including parenting mediation. He knew about mediation, he knew about the mediation centers, and so he ended up, we were able to broker a Parenting Act fund to underwrite the cost of providing mediation to indigent and low-income parents. And so that continues on. You know, we also have basic mediation education that's going on at the University of Nebraska Omaha College of Communication. So I think anytime we can educate individuals who then come out and be active members of government and the community in ADR, then it's building sustainability over the long term. So that kind of reflects what I would call current and potential allies. And then current issues, catching the wave. I am definitely Midwestern. I grew up in Illinois. I've lived in Nebraska most of my life. I have never surfed in my life. However, the idea of catching the wave often comes to mind, so that, when we see that there's some trends and opportunities coming down the pike, that how can we get on board? And one of the most recent waves that's happening in Nebraska is that our juvenile justice system, the juvenile justice case management, shifted last year from our Health and Human Services Agency to the judicial branch under our probation. And I know not every state has probation under the judicial branch, but Nebraska does. And so 8 years ago, I facilitated our new probation administrator strategic planning, and one of the probation's new mission statements 8 years ago was to shift from a criminal mentality to more of a restorative justice mentality, and so their mission statement has the term restorative justice in it. So here it is, 8 years later. There's been this shift of juvenile justice from executive branch to judicial branch. The administrator for probation, we've said all along we want to get more restorative justice in the system, but it just hadn't been the right time. There's not enough resources, there's not enough energy and vision. So planting the seeds with restorative justice, and we still have a ways to go. Just to say that we had, for example, Dr. Mark Umbright from Minnesota in Nebraska back in the 90s, back when there was JVIC money to do victim offender mediation, and we did what I call, those incremental grassroots level VOM cases, and really worked hard. People worked really hard locally with stakeholders to try to get that kind of program sustained, but it just didn't have the gas to keep it going. And so here it is, at least 15 years later, getting close to 20, and the wave now is prison overcrowding, too many youth in the correctional, the juvenile detention facilities. We should be doing things different. Should we really try restorative justice, victim offender mediation, et cetera, circles, what have you? And so we brought Mark Umbright down to Nebraska through another initiative in September to plant some more seeds, to judges hear about restorative justice, victim offender. We again have incremental VOM going on, but it's not integrated into the system, which, being a director of a mediation center for 14 years, I learned really quickly that, there's a lot of great ideas out there, but unless you have traction and unless you have, a structure and a foundation to build on it, we have too few human beings to make it work, so I'm not going to put a lot of energy into something unless I see there's other allies out there who want to make it go. And so we have a mini grant to a Nebraska foundation to expand victim offender mediation in 2 jurisdictions, and to bring Mark Umbright down to do more training and protocol development with the concept, and the state court administrator has been in on this, that if we show good outcomes, then he's willing to go to the legislature in 2 years on our next biennium budget to put this in the Supreme Court budget. All of that right now is still totally up in the air. It's not that, I'm definitely a hopeful person. I'm solidly pragmatic, and I do get my feelings hurt when things don't go well. I should just say I get discouraged at times because, we are still the add-ons. We're not, when many of you or some of you had funding cut in 2007, the Supreme Court looks at its budget and, what's the first thing to go. And I know that my office and what we're doing here is right next to the edge of the cliff on any given day. However, I think we believe in this process, and more people are seeing it, giving people a forum to solve their own problems and to work things out, addresses the relationship as well as the problem. And that provides sustainability for our families and communities. So, we all believe in that. So I'm going to stop there, but you can advance to the next page and just check in to see if there's any questions or comments. If not, Gabrielle, if you want to go to the next page. This page this page gets a little more explicit about the shifts that have happened in Nebraska. And again, each one of us has to, have our finger on the pulse in the state that we're in, because we know things are a little different from state to state, and catching that wave. So this is a list of some of the shifts in the last 2.5 decades that have impacted community mediation. And so the first one that I wanted to mention is 2007. As I said, the Speaker of the Legislature, who had graduated from law school, who had mediation, he represented a parent in a divorce case and wasn't able to negotiate the parenting plan, the custody issue, and the other party called the 10-year-old son to the witness stand to testify about custody. And just a footnote here, Nebraska tends to be so far behind in a lot of ways of what's happening on the coast and in other places, that some of you may say, well, we've been there, we've done that, which is very true, and yet in some ways we have the blessing of being able to see what's worked in other jurisdictions that you've done and take the best of what you've done and try to replicate it here, and also not adopt what other jurisdictions have done. So this speaker wanted to have mandatory mediation prior to custody trial, and he really liked this California provision, at least in some of their jurisdictions, where the mediator, if there was not a resolution, would shift and be an arbitrator, and then, or a custody evaluator, and make an evaluation to the judge. And when we saw, members of the mediation system saw the speaker's original bill, we were all aghast and up in arms, because I'm sitting here in the state capitol on the 12th floor in my ivory tower, and I'm still a purist as far as I'm concerned. If it's called mediation, the mediator doesn't become an arbitrator or an evaluator. I don't mind those approaches as long as they're clearly identified, but I'm very strong in keeping mediation the purest definition, and I think that that's critical. Because I was educated early on in the 80s and 90s by some of our colleagues that there's a definite slide, especially if you're in the court system, to try to co-opt the essential elements of mediation. So the speaker agreed not to go with that provision, but our compromise was that how do we address those very difficult cases that there's not a resolution through normal mediation? And what we did in the statutory design group and this is part of the allies, is that mediation, family law, domestic violence, judge, Voices for Children, we're all at the table actually drafting the Parenting Act revisions and worked on this for well over a year. Lots of very roll up the sleeves, what will work, lots of debates between the domestic violence people and the mediators and the family lawyers. And I'm happy to say it was a collaborative approach, and we created what we call specialized ADR, which is basically taking some restorative justice principles such as victim sensitivity, offender accountability, and safety, and embedding them into the process where the SATR process, specialized ADR, and actually every parenting mediation statutorily requires an individual private session that the mediator does with each party, at which time the mediator has a duty, statutory duty, to determine whether to go forward in joint session or to go forward in separate sessions, basically, on different days. And so that was implemented into the statute, and because the speaker wanted mediation required prior to contested custody trial, we successfully negotiated with our allies, with the legislature, for a $50 filing fee for all dissolutions and custody actions. And that fee underwrites some of the costs for the mediation centers to do parenting mediation. And we're re-looking at fee generates about a little over $500,000 a year, and we allocate it. We have a committee that annually allocates those funds to the centers to provide $20,000 per center in program management, and then the balance is allocated based upon the number per capita number of cases filed in the courts in each center area. We're right now evaluating the revenue, and is that working from a business perspective? Are the centers losing money doing this or not? Is there, are we missing some revenue streams, especially in the unmarried cases? And I won't get into the weeds on that, but we're looking at that right now. And just to note, there was in 2010 challenges to whether there should be a legal presumption of joint custody. That has pushed that same speaker to ask my office to do a comprehensive research evaluation of our Parenting Act. So that's underway right now by the National Center for State Courts. And that's going to have an economic benefit assessment in there. And that may very well inform future legislation and funding of the mediation program, at least under the Parenting Act. So that's a real question mark on how that's going to play out. But my office is the program manager for that evaluation. So it's kind of a mechanism to engage people in the question of ADR, especially in parenting cases. And because I'm working with the National Center, we're also examining the triage. And some of you probably have come across that. Is there a different way for courts to triage custody cases? And where does ADR fit into that triage? And I, and everything that I've read and talked about, ADR does fit in the triage, and if so, and the state requires it or makes it available, what's the responsibility of the state to pay for it? And then 2013, I mentioned there was a shift in juvenile probation from executive branch to judicial branch. As I said, that has raised the whole question of restorative justice and using approaches such as circles and victim offender mediation and family group conferencing. And in 2014, earlier this year, there was a shift of child welfare dollars from the executive branch to the judicial branch, in which historically our Health and Human Services Agency funded the mediation centers under contracts to do family group conferencing and what we're now calling pre-hearing conferencing. So at initial removal, at the 12-month review, and at termination of parental rights, we have conferencing options then that the mediation centers do, and we have a rate scale. And historically, HHS had either contracted with the centers or granted money, federal money, to my office to do that. Our HHS office is going through lots of changes, and they wanted to get out of that business. And our courts have increased their engagement of the provision of services versus executive branch. And so catching the wave a year ago, about right now, the Chief Justice, the head of HHS, our Center on Children, Family, and the Law, and my office had some dialogue about shifting the funds from HHS to the judicial branch, as well as the authority for referring from HHS to the judicial branch. And we had legislation that I worked really hard on this spring, which culminated in shifting funds and the authority to my office, the Supreme Court, so that now our juvenile judges can order 6 different types of child welfare conferencing, including family group conferencing and the termination of parental rights and those kinds of conferencing. And so this is a brand new experiment. I don't think $450,000 is going to be enough over the long term. It's per year. We do about 500 initial pre-hearing removal cases, and we do about 250 of all the other kinds of cases. And again, Nebraska has a smaller population. We have 1.8 million in our state, so it's a relatively smaller number. So my office is tracking all of that. And then this restorative justice, juvenile victim offender sentencing, I described that wave and what we're doing now. And it's building those relationships, cultivating those partnerships. The Center on Children, Family, and the Law has been critical in this. It's a University of Nebraska kind of freestanding organization that actually our court improvement person, most of the states have that court improvement program within the judicial branch. We've contracted it with the Center for Children and Family and the Law for many years. And so back in 2005, I think it was, when the Pew Charitable Foundation called the Chief Justice Supreme Court and the head of HHS to this national conference to try to break down the silos between the courts and child welfare, the way Nebraska implemented it was this center helped regions across the state create court-based child welfare teams. And so we have the judge, the Health and Human Services, the CASA, the mediator, although we're always trying to barge our way to the table. We're not at every table. County attorneys, and they have different levels of engagement. But the purpose is to see what are we doing to break down the system barriers to permanency for children in child abuse and neglect cases. And now that same group is also addressing juvenile justice cases. And we have about 40 of those teams in Nebraska. And that has really been helpful because there's more focus on collaboration at the local level, and the mediation centers, as I said, tend to nose their way into the table as much as we can. And that's really helped, building those relationships, centers, continuing meeting with judges and these other stakeholders. They play out over time, and we're doing this with the centers. Their foundational funds that they get from my office is $45,000 per year. So it's not much money. It's based upon a 75-cent filing fee on every court case. The revenue is about $280,000 a year. And I can tell you, as a former director, $45,000 doesn't keep the door open very long. So each of the centers are doing a lot of hustling and getting revenue from other sources, private client pay, as well as training and facilitation. And they're doing it on a shoestring, whatever you call it, shirt tail number of staff, and a lot of affiliates who really value the mission and give of their time. And I'm, as I said, we're always one step away from that edge of that cliff of staying alive, but we're still here. So go to the next slide. The last point there, the mediation centers, individual regional initiatives, they are doing, individual initiatives and local grants, and what they do successfully locally can inform the whole state. It plants seed with local foundations and local government. So, for example, this victim offender mediation, we know at least a third of the cases are best taken care of at the diversion level. Well, my office doesn't get involved with outside of court programs directly, and so the regional centers work with their local county governments and municipal governments on, for example, diversion, a victim offender. It's still slim pickings for money, and so proving we're in this evidence-based practice arena world. So my office is attempting to more and more help the centers gather the raw data to feed into a possible mini evaluation. We use just mediate.com's case manager, and we're usually at least annually going back to them saying, would you please create a new screen for us, a new outcome. We're actually working this year to create new data points on the child welfare cases, so that even though it won't be an official evaluation, it'll give us the raw data that we could possibly have an evaluator assess. Mediator credentialing has, I was going to say, reared its ugly head. When I first started in this job, I thought, I know this is on the horizon and I don't want to have to deal with it, but we are dealing with it. So mediation centers had always kept credentials on their mediators, and there were statutory requirements of basic and family training, for example. With the Parenting Act revisions, there was additional statutory training and credentialing requirements, so that my office now, there's one set of mediators that we're approving, and those are parenting mediators. And that's because when court orders people to parenting mediation, we want to make sure that the parenting mediators are credentialed. So every 2 years they have to submit a biannual report. And I have a half-time staff person who works on that. And with this new child welfare shift, I've determined that I need to in my office, because my office is paying for that, I need to credential the center. I need to have records of the center's credentialed facilitators. So the centers are still credentialing based upon policy, but I'm keeping the records as well in my office. Funding, I think that $45,000 is too low. I've talked to the Chief Justice about increasing it. I'm at the bottom of the totem pole, so I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. But as I said, I'm always trying to be alert to catch the wave and continue to build the allies and to do the good work and to track it. And my office, I'm full-time ODR. I have a part-time administrative assistant and a part-time Parenting Act credentialer, case management person. So I'm fairly small staff as well. So I'm going to close there, but just open it up if there's any questions that I can be of help with.
Yes, this is Deborah. I have just two tangents I wanted to ask. In general terms, with the limited funds and resources and everybody having, you know, devices, smartphones, and so on and so forth, do you see the mediation going towards virtual mediation, you know, for cost effectiveness and also for safety, people that are, you know, pretty angry and hostile towards one another being able to mediate from remote locations?
Oh, absolutely, and mediation centers are doing remote, you know, I mean, that's pretty rudimentary, conference calls, phone, some Skyping is going on, some online, and I know there's online dispute resolution seminars going on all the time. So I know that that's definitely happening now, and how it's going to play out programmatically, I'm not real sure yet. But because I'm in the court system, the courts are still pretty much building based, even though they're using technology. I think we're in the slowest branch in terms of moving into all virtual, but one of our Supreme Court justices, his goal is no paper, go virtual.
Well, if I could, virtual meeting, if people want to take a peek at that, they're doing simulations, and I've done some volunteer simulations with them. It's really a wonderful, wonderful resource. I have a second question. Excuse me. Do you see any possibility of, you know, like riding the shirt tails or any back door where you could collaborate with the Department of Justice and community-oriented policing and see some you know, some of your funding and some of your you know, your goals and your missions, you know, aligning with what they've got on their plate, and maybe you know, getting some of those dollar bills coming your way?
You know, I haven't been in the federal trough for a long time. When I was up in northeast Nebraska, I did have a weed and seed 5-year grant and got involved with Department of Justice and community policing, and I know NAFCM had some community policing initiatives back in, you know, early 2000s. And I think, you know, there's probably people on the phone that know much more than I do of what the possibilities are at the Department of Justice and community policing. But I absolutely, I think that's an opportunity for NAFCM to explore. Other, you know, OJJDP, I am tipping my toe in that for the juvenile restorative justice. I frankly am not, I'm totally out of the loop on where the feds are at with initiatives, and so maybe other people have, you know, much more information than me. I've always, since I've been here for 9 years, I've really focused on trying to get state funding, and I know that's hard. It's grindingly slow. However, and some of the state funding is federally funded, so Department of Education special ed mediation, which we didn't really talk about, that comes through our state offices, but it's federally sourced. I just feel really strongly that you can use some federal dollars for a period of time, and maybe that's your wild card for the next 3 years. But at least the way I think, I want to establish sustainability that's more localized so that it'll have a better chance of being here for the long term. And that's just how I think about things.
Thank you. I was just asking because it just seems like the the basic goal and the basic premise is very similar. It's like we're doing the same dance, let's dance together kind of thing.
Absolutely.
Thanks.
Any other questions or thoughts for Deborah? Deborah, thank you for your time. Thank you, everyone, for participating. A lot of great information and a lot of, I think, confirmation of what many of us experience on the state level. And so to find that unity so we can gather our resources moving forward and have an understanding of what's taking place around the country is such a helpful information share. Any other thoughts or questions before we end our session today?
When will this be available to look at again?
I probably beginning next week.
Great, thank you.
Absolutely. So appreciate everyone's time today. So appreciate your interest in this topic, and wishing everyone a safe and happy weekend before the holiday season jumps on full swing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take
Bye-bye.
care.